The following clip is an excerpt from my book review and analysis of The Gulag Archipelago Volume 1 by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Now here is a little biographical information about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn that I think is worth knowing before watching. Aleksandr I. Solzhenitsyn was born in Kizlovodsk, Russia on December 11, 1918. He earned a degree in mathematics and physics from Rostov University and studied literature through a correspondence course from the Moscow Institute of History, Philosophy, and Literature. A captain in the Soviet Army during World War II, he was arrested in 1945 for criticizing Stalin and the Soviet government in private letters. He was sentenced to 8 years of incarceration to be followed by perpetual internal exile, but was cleared of all charges in 1957 as part of Nikita Khrushchev's campaign of de-Stalinization. Solzhenitsyn vaulted from unknown schoolteacher to internationally famous writer in 1962 with the publication of his novella One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which Khrushchev himself authorized. The writer's increasingly vocal opposition to the regime resulted in another arrest, a charge of treason, and expulsion from the USSR in 1974. For 18 years of his exile, he and his family lived in Vermont. In 1994, he returned to Russia, thus fulfilling his long-standing prediction. He died at his home in Moscow on August 3, 2008. Solzhenitsyn's major works include the novels In the First Circle and Cancer Ward, the memoirs The Oak and the Calf, and Invisible Allies, a cycle of historical novels with the series title The Red Wheel, and the monumental history of the Soviet prison system, the Gulag Archipelago, which Time magazine named the best nonfiction work of the 20th century. In 1970, Solzhenitsyn received the Nobel Prize in Literature. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I here present to you the clip that you actually wanted to watch whenever you clicked on this video. The next section of this video is called Where Cancel Culture Has Gone and Will Go. But I do need to preface this section with a little bit of information. Namely that cancel culture is real. I do not understand these people who seem to be under the impression that it's not real. Cancel culture is basically the forcing of your beliefs on other people, even going so far as to take away their job, take away their voice. That is what cancel culture is in the American context. Now, where it goes is where it went in the Soviet Union, which I will explain in a minute. But, the list of people that have been canceled is very long now. I mean, this ideology, this honestly, I do have to point fingers. This woke ideology is the primary culprit of this evil, I would say. Kevin Hart makes a joke about gay people 10 years ago. How dare he commit the crime of being a comedian? And these people, they forced him to step down from the Oscars. He apologized. They wouldn't forgive him. He kept on apologizing until they went away. I mean, this culture it's everywhere. Gina Carano, if you actually read what she wrote on Instagram concerning, political tribalism, she was absolutely correct. And yet she was fired from Disney for her political beliefs, even though she didn't even state any of them. So weird. Everybody said that she was, trying to draw an equivalency between conservatives and, Jews being persecuted and in Nazi Germany, but she didn't even say conservative or liberal. She just said, hey, if you create a society that just hates certain groups of people, you could end up committing genocide like the Germans did. And she was correct. And yet she was the one who was canceled. And honestly, the people that canceled her kind of proved her point. They hated her. They treated her like crap. They demonized her, dehumanized her. And this cancel culture, I don't want to spend too much more time talking about the American version of it. But you need to acknowledge that it exists. I mean, Twitter has a misgendering policy that is ideologically motivated. Namely, a band of conservatives did not come up with it, even if you agree with it. A bunch of Oklahomans didn't come up with that, probably. And they have used that to ban people that say things like, a man can never be a woman. Example of this is Megan Murphy. I mean, the list goes on and on of those who have been canceled, and it's a very, very ugly thing. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And I would like to illustrate just how dangerous it can get. In order to understand this passage, you have to understand that Solzhenitsyn is talking about the show trial of the famine organizers. The Soviet Union kind of went to great lengths in the 20s and 30s to blame all of their mistakes on innocent people. And so they found these people that they call the wreckers, people in the food industry, that they determined organized the famine, when in reality it was really caused by the Communist Party. So just know that going in, that this is what Solzhenitsyn is talking about whenever he makes reference to the way the people were made to cheer for these false convictions, these cancelings of individuals who actually didn't do anything wrong. Also, I need to point out that whenever Solzhenitsyn speaks about sewage disposal, he's not actually talking about sewage disposal. He's using this as a term. It's kind of like a metaphor for how the Soviet Gulag system would just wash society of its goodness, and just it was like a sewage pipe. It was just like a sewage disposal system. That's what the Gulag was like. It would just take people out and send them off to nowhere. And so that's what he means whenever he makes reference to sewage disposal in this passage. It was precisely at this moment that an important step was taken toward universal participation in sewage disposal, universal distribution of responsibility for it. Those who had not yet been swept bodily down the sewer hatches, who had not yet been carried through the pipes to the archipelago, had to march up above, carrying banners praising the trials and rejoicing at the judicial reprisals. And this was very far-sighted. Decades would pass and history would have its eyes opened, but the interrogators, judges, and prosecutors would turn out to be no more guilty than you and I, fellow citizens. The reason we possess our worthy gray heads is that in our time we worthily voted for. Cancel culture began during this time with complicity. People, they went along with what the government said. Oh, of course these people are the bad people. We will cheer for them to be thrown down the sewer hatches. We will be happy to see them canceled. And this sort of thing happens. Even in these people did this, when they knew that it wasn't quite as straightforward as the party was making out to be. They knew something was up, and yet they did it anyways. They carried banners and was like, oh yes, justice is done, yada, yada, yada. They were cheerleaders for other people getting canceled. This is something that happens in the U.S. all the time, and it's very interesting. You see these, these people who cheer whenever, for instance, Donald Trump was banned. They're like, oh, yay, great, this is amazing. But as always happens in some of these people, they themselves got banned. And went, what? How? The cancel culture comes to you. It always does. This is the way this sort of stuff works. And it's ugly all the way around. And in the Soviet Union, it was particularly ugly because there were physical physical consequences. Like the cancellations back in the Soviet Union were real physical ones. In our day and age, they're primarily virtual. For now. Then came the time, slowly it is true, but surely, when it was the turn of the members of the ruling party to do time in prison. At first, from 1927 to 1929, it was a question of the workers' opposition, in other words, the Trotskyites, who had chosen themselves such an unsuccessful leader. They numbered hundreds at the start. Soon there would be thousands. But it's the first step that's the hardest. Just as these Trotskyites had observed with approval the arrest of members of other parties, so the rest of the party now watched approvingly as the Trotskyites were arrested. But everyone would have his turn. The non-existent rightist opposition would come later, and limb by limb, beginning with its own tail, the ravenous maw would devour itself, right up to its head. If you cancel Abraham Lincoln, tear down his statue, guess whose statue's gonna be torn down? Yours, by future generations who will not have sympathy for you. If you applaud, somebody who's politically opposite of you being banned on social media, guess what's going to happen to you whenever some of your views go outside the mainstream? You're going to get canceled, and you're going to be like, oh shit, I see why that was a problem for me to cheerlead about, other people being canceled. This is not okay. You should not. You got to take a stand on principle with regards to this stuff. because the ravenous maw will devour itself right up to its head every single time, and you do not want to be that head. Now this next passage is, it's just kind of a curious parallel between the past and the present. I'm just going to read it and we'll discuss. The revolution had hastened to rename everything so that everything would seem new. Thus the death penalty was rechristened the supreme measure, no longer a punishment, but a means of social defense. Now, as far as I know, nobody is calling for the death penalty to be renamed the supreme measure and as a tool of social defense, but it is true that our society is obsessed with renaming things so that everything seems new. We do away with the past so that way we can have a pure present. Of course, this is lunacy, but nevertheless, it is reality these days. It's interesting to read a Soviet dissident describe the slow process of dehumanization. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn in Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, he has this 2-page passage. I'm going to read the whole thing. It's actually more like 3 pages. Where he talks about how a certain class of people, known as the kulaks, were, through a slow process of dehumanization and propaganda, or by means of propaganda, were made to be seen by society and by the government as a nuisance to be got rid of. I find this passage to be so incredibly relevant to today concerning the way certain political factions in this country characterize other political factions and the people that exist in them. I will explain further what I mean by this after I read the passage, so without further ado, let's read the passage. And so the waves foamed and rolled, but over them all, in 1929 and 1930, billowed and gushed the multi-million wave of dispossessed kulaks. It was immeasurably large, and it could certainly not have been housed in even the highly developed network of Soviet interrogation prisons, which in any case were packed full by the gold wave. Instead, it bypassed the prisons, going directly to the transit prisons and camps, onto prisoner transports into the Gulag country. In sheer size, this non-recurring tidal wave, it was an ocean, swelled beyond the bounds of anything the penal system of even an immense state can permit itself. There was nothing to be compared with it in all Russian history. It was the forced resettlement of a whole people, an ethnic catastrophe. But yet, so cleverly were the channels of the GPU Gulag organized that the cities would have noticed nothing had they not been stricken by a strange 3-year famine, a famine that came about without drought and without war. This wave was also distinct from all those which preceded it because no one fussed about with taking the head of the family first and then working out what to do with the rest of the family. On the contrary, in this wave, they burned out whole nests, whole families from the start, and they watched jealously to be sure that none of the children, 14, 10, even 6 years old, got away. To the last scrapings, all had to go down the same road, to the same common destruction. This was the first such experiment, at least in modern history. It was subsequently repeated by Hitler with the Jews, and again by Stalin with nationalities which were disloyal to him or suspected by him. This wave included only pathetically few of those kulaks for whom it was named, in order to draw the wool over people's eyes. In Russian, a kulak is a miserly, dishonest, rural trader who grows rich not by his own labor, but through someone else's, through usury and operating as a middleman. In every locality, even before the revolution, such kulaks could be numbered on one's fingers. And the revolution totally destroyed their basis of activity. Subsequently, after 1917, by a transfer of meaning, the name kulak began to be applied in official and propaganda literature, whence it moved into general usage, to all those who in any way hired workers, even if it was only when they were temporarily short of working hands in their own families. But we must keep in mind that after the revolution, it was impossible to pay less than a fair wage for all such labor. The committees of the poor and the village Soviets looked after the interests of landless laborers. Just let somebody try to swindle a landless laborer. To this very day, in fact, the hiring of labor at a fair wage is permitted in the Soviet Union. But the inflation of this scathing term, kulak, proceeded relentlessly, and by 1930, all strong peasants in general were being so called. All peasants strong in management, strong in work, or even strong merely in convictions. The term kulak was used to smash the strength of the peasantry. Let us remember, let us open our eyes. Only a dozen years had passed since the great decree on the land, that very decree without which the peasants would have refused to follow the Bolsheviks, and without which the October Revolution would have failed. The land was allocated in accordance with the number of mouths per family, equally. It had been only 9 years since the men of the peasantry had returned from the Red Army and rushed onto the land they had wrested for themselves. Then suddenly there were kulaks and there were poor peasants. How could that be? Sometimes it was the result of differences in initial stock and equipment. Sometimes it may have resulted from luck in the mixture of the family. But wasn't it most often a matter of hard work and persistence? And now these peasants, whose bread grain had fed Russia in 1928, were hastily uprooted by local good-for-nothings and city people sent in from outside. Like raging beasts, abandoning every concept of humanity, abandoning all humane principles which had evolved through the millennia, they began to round up the very best farmers and their families, and to drive them, stripped of their possessions, naked, into the northern wastes, into the tundra and the taiga. Such a mass movement could not help but develop subsequent ramifications. It became necessary to rid the villages also of those peasants who had merely manifested an aversion to joining the collective farms, or an absence of inclination for the collective life, which they had never seen with their own eyes, about which they knew nothing, and which they suspected, we now know how well-founded their suspicions were, would mean a life of forced labor and famine under the leadership of loafers. Then it was also necessary to get rid of those peasants, some of them not at all prosperous, who, because of their daring, their physical strength, their determination, their outspokenness in meetings, and their love of justice, were favorites with their fellow villagers and by virtue of their independence were therefore dangerous to the leadership of the collective farm. Beyond this, in every village, there were people who in one way or another had personally gotten in the way of the local activists. This was the perfect time to settle accounts with them of jealousy, envy, insult. A new word was needed for all these victims as a class, and it was born. By this time, it had no social or economic content whatsoever, but it had a marvelous sound. Podkulachnik, a person aiding the kulaks. In other words, I consider you an accomplice of the enemy, and that finishes you. The most tattered landless laborer in the countryside could quite easily be labeled a podkulachnik. And so it was that these two terms embraced everything that constituted the essence of the village, its energy, its keenness of wit, its love of hard work, its resistance, and its conscience. They were torn up by the roots, and collectivization was accomplished. So the reason I read that passage, and the reason I think it is so relevant to today's, political fanaticism, is if you notice, the term kulak changed meaning to encompass way more people than the actual definition of the term would ordinarily, encompass. Initially it meant, just kind of like a greedy person who profits off of the labor of other people. And Solzhenitsyn talked about how there was not really that many people that even did that back then. There was a very small handful. But the Soviets, they needed an excuse for arrest, and they needed to kind of destroy the whole kulak culture, the whole political class of, independent farmers and people who just wanted to live their own life apart from the collectivized state. And so they expanded the term kulak. And it began to take on, just regular people who they just weren't the biggest fan of this communist idea of the way to run a farm. And this term kulak got so big and it encompassed so many people that its initial meaning didn't mean any, no longer applied. And then what was so fascinating in this passage is it talked about how then that wasn't even enough. No, they needed to come up with a term, they said podkulachnik. I can't really pronounce that very well, but the Soviets had to come up with a new term, and so that they could arrest more people who were associated with the kulaks. And this was all, of course, in an effort to, dismantle the whole bourgeoisie, structure in Russia. And it ended with a famine, as Solzhenitsyn said, that was not caused by drought or war. It was just an evil, evil famine. And it's fascinating, where you read later in the book how, the Soviets then put people on trial and blamed them for the famine, when in reality it was the Soviets that caused the famine in the first place. I think that this, expansion of the meaning of terms, this changing of definitions, is something that's taking place right now in America. Bear with me here, but the term white supremacist is, I think, very similar to the term kulak, in that, truth be told, there's a very, very, very small amount of actual true white supremacist. I've never met a KKK member in my life. Of the people that I've met who have said racist things, it's a very small handful, and none of them would identify as white supremacists. This is my entire life, and I live in Oklahoma, the reddest state in the country, okay? And yet, all day long, we hear on CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, talking about how, basically white supremacy is behind every corner. And how white supremacists are, up to something. Of course they are up to something, but the number is, like I said, so small. And yet, our media talks about white supremacists all the time. And my theory, and I think this is a fair thing to say, my theory is that the term white supremacist has been hijacked by a bunch of propaganda artists who they want to, instead of meeting the arguments of, say, people on the political right who are more conservative, they just want to label them as white supremacists. They expand the term of white supremacist to mean anyone who is remotely conservative. Again, I think this is a fair observation. It seems to me like the left is very content to flippantly call people who voted for Trump white supremacists or Nazis. I'm sorry, the data's not there to support that half of the country are a bunch of white supremacists and Nazis. It's a good way to, chill the speech of conservatives, because they're afraid that they might be called a white supremacist. Now, am I saying that this is going to end in a genocide of people that are Republicans or are conservatives or, right-wing libertarians? No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that that same propagandistic tactic used by the leftist Soviets is being used by the leftist Americans, of taking a term that describes a very, very small group of people and using that term in a very disingenuous and dishonest way to malign a whole bunch of people that are completely innocent of white supremacy. I think it is incumbent upon all of us to commit to stop this bullshit. So if you're on the left and, you disagree with conservatives, maybe you even just hate them, don't stoop to the level of calling people white supremacist Nazis unless they actually are that, unless you actually have evidence of that. And similarly, if you're on the right, don't stoop so low as to call everyone on the left a communist. It's not okay to malign entire groups of people based on very, very small minorities of actually bad people. So let's stop this nonsense, people. Let's cancel culture.